Hello everyone, this is Reza Dorani. In today's video, we will build an Excel-like editable grid experience in Power Apps. The grid will perform full CRUD operations, creating, reading, updating, and deleting records from a data source. And not just that, we will also add auto-saving and undo operation. So let's go ahead and get started with the video, but first, my introduction. So let's begin with creating an editable grid Excel-like experience in Power Apps. Now, first thing, what is an editable grid? For folks who are very familiar with SharePoint, edit in grid view experience, which is very similar to Excel, wherein I can interact with my SharePoint list directly in this grid view experience. So for example, if I would like to add some sample description right here or make any modifications right here, I can easily go ahead and make the changes on the fly in this grid-like experience. And if I exit the grid view, this will go ahead and store that information in the SharePoint list. From a Microsoft Dataverse for Teams experience standpoint, when you create tables, these tables as well have an edit data feature which opens a very similar grid experience for us directly in the context of Microsoft Teams. The example that I'm taking into consideration for today's demo is a table that I have built in Dataverse. So here in Dataverse is a table called work task, and as part of this table, I have gone ahead and created 5 columns. Name is the primary column. I have a column called due date to maintain the due date of my work task. I have a couple of choice fields, priority and the status of my task. And finally, I have an auto number field that automatically increments based on data or records that come into my table. So now what I would like to do is in Power Apps, create an Excel-like experience so I can go ahead and perform full CRUD operations, create, read, update, and delete on my data table, in this case, my work task table. Now in Power Apps, the first step is for me to connect to my data source. So I will head over to data sources, search for work tasks, and just like that, I have connected my table that I created in Dataverse in my Power App. The same concept will work for any data source of choice, SharePoint, SQL, so on and so forth. Now, because I want to create a grid-like experience and I'm going to deal with multiple records, whenever you have to interact with multiple data, always think of galleries first. So in my case, I will go ahead and go to gallery and select a blank vertical gallery experience. So I will go ahead and just connect it to my work task data source. Now, because I want to create an editable grid-like experience so the users can interact with the grid, let's go ahead and start adding all the different controls with respect to the grid that I would like to create. Now, in my case, first I would like to show the task ID, which is that auto number field. Now that field generates data automatically. You cannot edit that field. So I will go ahead and add a simple label control right here. And for the text property of the label, I will go ahead and set this to this item dot task number. Next, I would like to add the name of the task. Now, because I want the user to edit this, I will go ahead and add a text input control right here. Next is the priority of the task. Priority is a choice field, so I will go ahead and insert a drop-down control right here. I have the status of my task, which is again going to be a drop-down control for me. And finally, I have the due date of my task, so I will go ahead and add a date picker control right here. If I play this app, you will notice that I don't see any data. That's purely because my table at the back end is empty. If I had any data, the gallery would start showing the rows. Now, in order for me to give the user an option to add rows, I will go ahead and add a button. And on select of this button, I would like to go ahead and create a new record in my table. And the way I can go ahead and create this record is by using the patch function. So patch my data source, which is work tasks. Because I want to create a new record, I will use defaults of work task. So it will use the default new item behavior of my table. And then all I have to do is provide my record details. Now in my table, The only field that's required is name. If there were any other required fields, we would have to ensure that we fill that when we are creating the item. In my scenario, it's only name. So all I've done here is entered an empty string in the name property for my record that I am creating right here. Now, if I play this app and if I click on add record, this will go and patch my table and create a new record. And as I start clicking this, if you notice, it will start adding new rows into my gallery. The template height of this gallery is something that we need to reduce. So I will go and edit this and ensure that I reduce the height of the gallery. Next step, for my grid, I want to create headers. So how do I do that? Very simple. I will just go ahead and create labels and give these labels the respective names. So in my scenario, this is the task number, task name, and so forth. So that's the headers that I've created for my data table. I will go ahead and add some background to this header. So I'll go to insert, go to icons, and select the rectangle shape. Place it right on top of my header controls, and then make sure that my header controls are brought to the front. So I've gone ahead and set the header. Now for my gallery control, I will just go ahead and add a border to this. So I'll give it a border color of blue, and I will ensure that the border thickness is 1. Now another important thing to note about this is if I select a control right here and if I hit tab on my keyboard, so it's going ahead and moving through my entire grid experience right here, so I can make changes to this on the fly. The information that's being displayed right here in this grid is not correct. For example, if you look at the task name text field, it has a default value of text input, but I want to get the default value from my record in my table, and the way I can do that is change the default value to this item dot name. And when I created these rows, when I clicked on add row, the name was empty, and of course all the other fields are going to be empty. So as you can see, the task name now is showing me the correct value, which is empty. Priority and status, both of these drop downs currently have sample values in them, but I want to get the actual choice values from my table. So in order to achieve that, for the priority drop down for the items property, I will change this to choices of priority, right? Priority is my column. So go and grab all the respective choices from that choice column that I created in my table. So if I play the app, this will show me all my 3 choices, which are low, medium, and high. Now, if you would like to have a blank value in here, in short, allow an empty selection, all you have to do is set the allow empty selection property to true. And this should now allow empty selections. So if the value is empty, this should be empty to start with. Now for the priority drop down as well, if I head over to the default value for the drop down, right now it's hard coded to 1, so it'll pick up the first value. So let's go and change this to this item dot priority. That's the name of my column, so it will default to the priority column value. And I will take exactly the same steps for the status column. So choices of task status, allow empty selection is true, and the default value is this item dot task status. For the date field, if you notice the default date is today's date, let's change this to this item dot due date. And now if I go ahead and play this app, this is now showing me accurate information, because right now I'm just creating empty rows in my database. And for these rows, I can enter the task name, I can select the priority, the status, and enter the due date associated with my task. Now to go ahead and delete records, once again, I will edit the gallery item, go to insert this time, go to icons, and select the delete icon. And when the user selects the item, I would like to go ahead and remove this item from my table. So I will call the remove function. Remove it from my data source, which is my work tasks table, and I would like to go ahead and remove this item. Now if I play this and if I start clicking on delete, this will start deleting the records from my data source. So you can see going and deleting items. If I click on add, it will create a new item, and the task number, which is the auto number field, is letting me know that new items are getting generated. The latest one now is item number 5. Now comes the key part. How do I make modifications to these records and then push these records out to my data source? There are multiple ways of achieving this. One option is we can push the changes on the fly live. That means the moment I select a cell in this editable grid and make any modification. So let's say I add here learning Power Apps. The moment I make this modification, this change gets pushed out to my data source. Now, in order to achieve something like that, what we need to do is for all the controls in my gallery that are editable. So in my case, I have this text box, drop down, and date control. I have gone ahead and selected all of these 4 controls. You can hold the control key and select all of them. And then for all of these controls, there is a property called onChange. That means whenever these values change, I want to perform an action. What I can do right here is this. So I can go ahead and patch my data source, which is my work task table. What is the record that I want to patch? The record is nothing but this item. And then what are the updates that I would like to push through? Now in my case, the updates are with relation to 4 columns in this case. The first one is name. So I can select name. And for this, I need to provide the data from this text control. Now I named this txt task name. So I'm going to leverage the text control dot text, and this is going to give me the data for the name, comma. The next one is the priority. So priority will be the priority dropdown dot selected dot value. Why? Because my dropdown itself is coming from my data source, and I leveraged the choices function to get that information. Same thing for the task status dropdown column. And then for the due date column, I will pick my date picker control dot the selected date. Now if I play this app, this will be like a live editable grid. So for example, let's say I'm going to say learn Power App. I've made a change. I'm going to click out. This is actually posting the data right now to my data source. I'm going to make another change. I'm going to say medium. This is again executing a query. I made a change. Status is complete. Due date, let's say, was the 1st. That's it. And I'm going to go ahead and let's say delete this record. I'm going to add a new record. Here's my next record. Notice that my information stays intact. If I go ahead and change the priority here, add some additional text here. If I create another row, notice the previous records are intact. So this is like a live editable grid. And at the same time, if I tap through this, as I mentioned, and if I make changes, right, literally very, very similar to Excel. I'm just making changes on the fly. This is going ahead and making the modifications for me. However, having done this, does this work? Yes. Is this the best way of doing it? Is this the most performant experience? No. Why? Well, every change that I make, it is pushing out an update to my data source. That means there is a query that's taking place. Power Apps has to query your data source. Power Apps is designed with the mobile experience in mind. You do not want a scenario wherein you are continuously executing queries against your data source. There is also something known as API calls. There are limits based on licensing as to how many API calls a user can make in a 24-hour period. Every change that I'm making here to any of the cells in this editable grid is executing a query against my data source. That means I'm losing API calls as I'm doing that. So why not call this only once the user has made all the changes, and we can see 2 scenarios in which we can execute all the changes at once. The first one I will show you is an on-demand save once the user makes all the changes. Now back to that same onChange formula for all my 4 editable controls. Instead of patching it directly to my data source, what I would like to do is something different. Let's first store all of the changes that the user is making in a collection. Let's hold it in a collection locally in memory, and once all the changes are done by the user can then click on a button that we will provide, and only then all the changes will be pushed at once with one single query to the data source. Also, think about this. If I am pushing changes out to my data source, in my case, I have this work task table. Now, right now, I'm just making changes to these 4 columns or 4 fields in my data source. However, if I head back to my data source and if I actually go to all the columns, you will note that in this scenario, there are plenty of other columns. Most of them are those system columns or standard columns that get generated for me. Even SharePoint for that matter, when you create a SharePoint list, it creates a lot of those system columns like created by, modified by. However, in my use case right here, when I'm creating this grid, I only want the user to modify these 4 specific columns. Now, when I'm going to create a collection, if I create a collection using this item, The problem is that this item is going to contain the context of that entire record. That means all the columns that are there in my table for that record. But in reality, all I need is those 4 columns because I'm just modifying these 4 columns. So a little bit of extra work, but it will give you a considerable performance gain. So how do I go about first creating a collection that has all of those columns so that I can go ahead and patch my data source? On start of the app, let's go ahead and execute clear collect to create a collection. I'm going to give this collection a name. I'm going to call this my collection task update. So whatever updates the user has made. And now what I need to provide this is all the columns from my data source. So the first step that we will execute is this. Clear collect collection task updates default of work tasks. If I go ahead and run the onStart function, and if I go to view and head over to collections, so you will note that this has created a collection for me that has a lot of columns right here, and also observe that it has all the internal names of my columns, and it has created an empty record for me purely because my formula stated create a collection and use the defaults function, which creates like a new item for my work task, and I've added that to my collection. Now I need to do a couple of things. One, of course, is to clear that record because I want my collection to be empty. And the simple way I can do that is by executing a clear function. And now if I run this, and if I head back to my collection, notice my collection does not have any record. And the reason why I did that is only because I wanted the schema of my table. And I've got all the columns of my table right here. But I'm only interested in updating the 4 columns because my data grid is providing modifications for only those 4 columns. Performance. So what we need to do right here is use a formula called show columns. So I'm going to call show columns. Now it's going to ask me for my data source. The data source has to be tabular in nature for show columns. So what we can also do is decorate the defaults function with a table function. And next step is for me to add all the columns that I require. Now in my case, notice Intellis is guiding me and providing me all the column names. So I need the name. So I'm going to pick the name, comma. I need the due date. I need the priority. And I need the task status. So I have got those 4 columns that I am modifying. However, one very important thing to understand, whenever you are modifying records in your data source using the patch function, you do need the primary key of your table. So if I head back to my table, which is my work task table, if you look right here, there is a unique identifier associated with my table. And this is the internal name of my column. For SharePoint folks, the internal name of your column is the ID column. For folks from SQL, you would have to create a primary key in your SQL table. That would be the name of the column that you would need in order to make modifications to your data using the patch function. So back to my app, I will also add a 5th column here as part of show columns, which will be that primary key. And once I complete this, this is how my show columns function looks like. So let's go ahead and run this function again. And this time, if I head back to my collection, notice my collection is empty and here's my schema. It has all those internal names of the columns that I wish to update. Next is for us to go and leverage this collection and start loading any changes that the user makes in the grid in this collection. And when do we start loading that? When the user makes changes to any of these 4 fields. So back to the onChange function, collect into the collection that we created, which is collection task updates. What are the different details that I want to collect? The first thing is I would like to have the primary key in there. So I'm just going to copy the internal name, and then I need to provide a value for this, which would be this item dot work task. And the task name is coming from that text box. Same concept as before, but all I'm doing right now is patching the columns in my collection. And this is what my formula looks like now. So every time a change is made to any of these items in the gallery, I would like to go ahead and start collecting the data in a collection. But wait, what happens if the user makes multiple changes to the same row? They change the task name, they change the priority, they change the status. Well, because I'm continuously collecting it in the same collection, it will create duplicate records for me. But that's something that I do not want to do. And in order for me to avoid that, I would have to check to see if this item is a part of that collection or not. And the way I can check that is this. if this item dot the primary key, which is the work task, if the primary key is already existing in the collection, so the collection dot the primary key column internal name. So if the item already exists in the collection, then in that case, I want to perform an update, call the update function. And what are we updating? We are updating our collection. Okay, which record do you want to update? Look up the collection where the primary key is equal to this item dot work task. So this will give me the association of the record that is currently in the collection for the current running item if it is already existing. The next step is the row that you want to update it with, and that will be exactly the same as the data that I'm adding in the collection. I'm just going to copy and paste that right here, complete my update function, put a comma, and that now completes my entire onChange formula. Let's go ahead and play this app, and let's start making a few changes to my grid once again. So I'm going to change this to medium, change this to low. Let's go and add some more data right here. Now, if we head back and look at the collection right here, notice the collection has 3 records only, and all the changes that we've made is available right here inside the collection. And where is all the data in the collection being held? Locally in the app for that user session. Right now, although the user has made changes, none of these changes are currently saved. That means we need to give the option to the user to go ahead and save their changes. I've just added another button, called it save. So here's the onSelect function. If that collection has data, that means the rows are greater than 0, go ahead and patch my data source with the collection. That's all I have to execute. Just give it my collection. Why? Because the collection has the same schema as my data source, and it also includes the primary key, so it will go and update the records. And then once it does that, I'm just notifying that we've gone ahead and completed that, and then I'm just clearing the collection. So let's go ahead and play this right now. So I've made a lot of changes. I will go ahead and click save. In one go with one query, this has gone ahead and patched my data source. Okay, so this is on-demand saving. What if the user is making changes? So let's say I just made a change and the user forgets to hit the save button. At least there needs to be some visual cue wherein I can tell the user that you have not gone ahead and saved your data. Please go ahead and save it, otherwise you will lose your changes. For the gallery, I will go ahead and add an icon, and I will select this warning icon right here. And let's also go ahead and change this to the color red because we want to warn the user. So for the visible property, we will change this to this item dot work task. That's my primary key. If this is in the collection, so the collection dot the work task ID column. So if I play this app right now, it's giving me a warning that I have not saved my changes right here. If I change this value right now, it'll give me a warning here as well. So this is a visual indicator to the user that there are certain changes that are pending, so they better go and hit the save button. Also, I have gone ahead and added the same icon right here and added a label that says you have pending changes to be saved. And both of these controls that I just added, I will show them only if the collection has data, right? So if the collection has data, that means there's something that's not saved. So if I play the app right now, notice it clearly tells me that you have pending changes to be saved. So that's a visual indicator to the user that please go ahead and save your changes. Otherwise, you will lose your changes. So once I hit the save button, this will go and patch my data source, clear the collection. Collection is empty. None of the warnings are showing up. I would like an auto-save kind of a feature wherein the app automatically checks to see if there is some data in the collection. If it is, just go ahead and patch it every X seconds. You can go to Insert and insert the timer control. Now, if I head over to the properties of the timer control, first thing is I want this timer control to automatically start, and I want this timer control to keep repeating itself once it completes its duration. The duration right now is 1 minute. I will change this, for example, to 15 seconds. The timer control has a property called on timer end. That means when this timer ends, I would like to perform some action. And the action that I want to perform on timer end is literally the same action that is on the save button. Now, instead of rewriting the formula, what you can also do is this. Here is the name of my button. So on this timer control, when the timer ends, literally all I want to do is this. There's a function called select, I'm going to give the name of my control, which is my save button. So literally what this timer will do is once the timer ends, it will go and select that save button for me. If I play this app right now, notice the timer is running, right? And I'm going to hide this timer so the user is not even aware of the fact that there's a timer running. Now, if I start making changes right here, right? I change this, and I'm not clicking on save, right? I'm just making modifications, or maybe I'm not taking any action. Notice what happened right here. The timer went ahead and selected that save button. So you can create like an auto save like experience for your users. The next feature that I would like to add to this gallery is either I want to view the grid or actually make it an editable grid. So for that, I have an image that I'm going to add right here, and I'm going to also add a button. Now for this button, what I would like to do is every time this button is clicked, I would like to first set a variable so I know what mode I would like the grid to be in. So on select of this button, what we are going to do is this. I'm going to set a variable. I'm going to call this where grid editable. That's the name of the variable that I'm creating. And what I would like to do is every time this variable is clicked, I would like to go ahead and set this variable to not of that variable. That means if it's true, it's going to become false. If it is false, it's going to become true. So I'm creating a Boolean variable right here. Also, for the text property of this variable, if it is true, then in that case, the grid will be editable. So the user can change it back to view mode. So I'm going to call this view grid or edit grid. Okay, so if I play this app right now, if I select this, this will change to view grid or edit grid based on my click. Now, of course, nothing is changing in the gallery. That's purely because I need to write the formula to make it editable or not. So for all of these 4 controls, if I head over to the display mode property, by default, the display mode is edit. If that variable is set, that means the variable is in edit mode, then show everything in edit. Otherwise, change the display mode of these controls to view. Right? So now if I play the app, if I click on view grid, this is going to show me the grid in view format. If I say edit grid, this is going to open up the grid in editable format for me. Also, the delete icon needs to only show if the grid is editable. So for that, all I have to do is set the visible property of this to that variable, which is the Boolean variable. So if I'm viewing the grid, it won't show. If it's editable, the grid will show up right here. Now, one final thing that I would like to add to this grid experience is the undo option. So what if the user comes in and makes certain changes, but they would like to undo all their changes? So right here, I've added an image for undo. And when the user selects this image, is clear the collection of changes. And then we will execute a refresh function on our data source. So that's how easy it is to go ahead and perform an undo action to the grid that we just created. Literally just clear the collection, refresh the data source. So here's a fully functional grid view in Power Apps, connected live to my data source, built this in a performant way. You can add rows, you can delete rows, you can update rows, you can view rows, you can save all the data at once in a performant manner. You can even have a timer control which auto saves. You also have undo. Basically a fully functional grid-like experience in Power Apps. I really hope everyone enjoyed this video. If you did, then do like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. And don't forget to hit the bell icon so that whenever I post my new video, you get the notification. Thank you so much for watching.